So in the last video, we created all of these variables here, and these variables are going to be used inside of a for loop, which we're about to create. And this for loop is going to dynamically create some jQuery code for us on the fly. And this jQuery will fade in, delay, and fade out some page elements, these page elements that we have highlighted here, these four. So let's start creating our for loop. For loops always start off with using the for keyword. Then you have some opening and closing parentheses, and then you have some opening and closing curly brackets. What goes inside these parentheses? Three things. An initializer, which is always var I equals 0. That's the way it always is. Don't ask me why, just do it like that. After the initializer is the condition, and the condition in this case is going to be I less than all LMs. And then we have an incrementer. The incrementer is I plus plus. So what's going on here? Well, the initializer var I equals 0. In the first video, I said that a for loop in JavaScript is code that acts as a souped up counter. And if we're counting numbers, we've got to start somewhere. We're starting our counting at 0. Why are we starting our counting at 0 instead of 1? Because computers count numbers using what's known as a zero-based index. Humans start counting their numbers off at 1. Computers start counting their numbers off at 0. And this is sort of tied into also something I said in the last video, why I started counting the numbers off at 0 here instead of 1. So that is the initializer. Then we've got the condition. Condition is saying I less than all LMs. In the context of a for loop, this is saying the exact same thing as long as I is less than all LMs. And you should look at the condition as the most powerful part of the for loop because it's defining how many times our for loop is going to count. It may be starting counting at 0 and it may be counting up, but it's not going to be counting up forever. All LMs is setting a limit on exactly what that limit is. And don't worry, I'm going to fill all this in case you're confused. And then we've got the incrementer, I plus plus. I plus plus is looking at whatever the current value of I is and then adding 1 onto it. So in other words, I plus plus is the exact same thing as saying I equals I plus 1. And it's also another shorthand way of saying it is I plus equals 1. So basically, this is saying the exact same thing as this, which is saying the exact same thing as that. Now, let's further break it down. Basically, all three of these things, the initializer, the condition, and the incrementer, they're working together as a team. Here's what's going on. The initializer starts counting I, and I is definitely equal to 0 at this point, so I'll just put a little reminder there. Then we jump over to the condition, and I is checking to see if I is less than whatever all LMs is. And in our last video, we said that all LMs equals 4, and so just for clarity, I'll put a 4 here. So the condition is going to check to see if the current value of I is less than 4, and it is because 0 is definitely less than 4. And if it is, it's going to count or increment, and that's where the incrementer kicks in. So I is going to add a value of 1 to itself at that point, so that means I is going to be equal to 1. And then we're going to go back into our loop, but we're not going to go to the initializer at this point because that would reset the counting process, which we don't want. We're just going to go straight to the condition. I is going to check to see if it's less than 4, and it is because 1 is definitely less than 4. The incrementer, excuse me, it's going to kick in, add a value of 1 to itself. That means I is going to be equal to 2. Then we're going to go to our condition again. I is going to check to see if it's less than 4, and it is because 2 is definitely less than 4. That means the incrementer is going to kick in again, add a value of 1 to whatever the current value of I is. That means I equals 3, and then our loop is done counting at this point because, as we said, the condition defines how many times our loop is counting. It's only supposed to count 4 times. As you can see, I has already counted 4 times, so our loop is done counting. We just move on to the next thing. The other stuff that we're doing has to do with what is in between these opening and curly brackets here. Basically, anytime the counting process, which I just described, occurs, every time it counts, whatever's inside of these brackets is going to be code that runs or executes. So let's talk about that. So every time my for loop counts, I'm going to create a brand new variable. I'm going to call this variable fading LM. And I'm going to set it equal to a text string pound LM plus I. So basically what's going on with this fading LM variable is what's known as concatenation. Whatever is on the right side of this plus sign is going to be tacked on to the end of what's on its left side and create a text string. So at some point I, which we have here, we know it's going to be equal to 0. And that concatenation thing which I just described, that means that fading LM will be pound LM0. No colon there. No semicolon, excuse me. So pound LM0, which just by no coincidence is the exact same ID name here. Definitely no coincidence. So that fading LM variable is going to be created. In the last video, we noticed that the jQuery that we're creating, it's going to be different. Different jQuery is going to be applied to these page elements here. As a reminder, our first page element gets a fade in, a delay, and a fade out. Our last page element gets a delay and a fade in. And all the others in between get a delay, a fade in, a delay, and a fade out. Our for loop needs to be able to understand which line of jQuery to apply to which page element. And we're going to do that inside of our for loop using something known as an if-else statement or a conditional statement. So the way that works is I'm going to create first one of 3 lines in my conditional statement. If I triple equals 0, create the following code, call jQuery, and I'm going to target the fading LM variable, and then I'm going to call jQuery fade in. I'm going to plug in the fade time variable here, then I'm going to call jQuery's delay function. I'm going to plug in the delay time variable, then I am going to call jQuery fade out, and I'm going to call the fade time variable again. So what's going on here? Well, at some point I is definitely going to be equal to 0. This triple equals is called the comparison operator. It's checking to see if what's on its left side, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, equals what's on its right side. And if that's the case, then this line of code is going to be created. And as you can see, it's using jQuery here, using the fade in, delay, and fade out function. But it's also targeting some variables which we created earlier. And those variables' values are going to be plugged into this code. So in other words, fading LM, basically that is concatenating whatever current value of I is, which is 0, to the end of this pound LM text string. So that means fading LM is going to be LM0. Then fade in is going to be called, and fade time we said earlier was 1,000, talking milliseconds, so we'll plug in 1,000 there. Delay time we said was 2,000 milliseconds, and fade time is being called again, and it's 1,000 milliseconds. So this is the code that's going to be created on the fly when I equals 0. And as you can see, based on the code we wrote up by hand, it pretty much matches this line here, except for the fact it doesn't have quotes behind pound LM, and that's fine. So before we continue, let's see if our code works. Let's fire up a browser. The first page element should fade in, delay, and fade out. Does that happen? Fade out. Excellent. Everything's good. So now I've got to create the other lines using my if-else statement. I'm going to call else this time, else if. And I'm going to create the jQuery code for the last line first. So that's going to check to see if I triple equals LM no fade, then the following line of code is going to be created. We're going to call jQuery again, call the fading LM, whoops, sorry about that, fading LM variable. Then we're going to call the delay function. We're going to use our total time variable for the first time. We're going to multiply that by I. Then we're going to call jQuery's fade in function, and we're going to fade it in. And whoop, jumped ahead there. Sorry. Pretend you didn't see that. Fade time. Okay. In our last video, we said that this LM no fade variable is going to help us target this the very last element that we want to fade out. And that last element should only get a delay and a fade in, and we've done that pretty well here. We've already done the delay and the fade time. So let's plug in the variables again like we did before. So fading LM, I definitely equals LM no fade. LM no fade we said was 3, so that means fading LM is going to be pound LM 3. then delay, then total time. This might be a little bit tricky. Total time we said in the last video was 3,000, so for total time we were going to plug in 3,000 milliseconds. We just said I is 3, so the 3 goes here. 3 is going to be multiplied by 3,000, which is 9,000, and then fade time is going to be called again. We've used that before. We said that was 1,000 milliseconds. So for the last element, which is LM3, let's confirm that it is indeed the last element. Yes. It's going to get a delay of 9,000 milliseconds and a fade-in of 1,000 milliseconds. As you can see, this pretty much matches the code we wrote up by hand. And finally, let me correct this code here. Now we are going to create the last line of jQuery code. We only have to create one more line because we're now targeting this element and this element and this element. Any elements in between the first and the last one, we noticed that they were the same, so we only have to create one line of jQuery for all of those bad boys. And I'm just going to say else, and that code is going to look like this. Call jQuery again. Whoop. There we go. We're going to call jQuery again. Call the fading LM. We're going to call a delay. We're going to call our total time variable again. We're also going to multiply that by I again. Then we're going to call the jQuery fade in function. And we're going to fade in whatever the value of fade time is. And then we're going to call jQuery's delay function. We're going to delay it for whatever the value of delay time. Whoop, can't spell, sorry, delay time is. And finally, we're going to fade it out in whatever the value of fade time is. All right, that's a long line. So let's fill it in. So we already said that this line we just created is targeting whatever's in the middle between the first and last elements we want to fade in. Let's say I is 1. Well, fading LM is going to concatenate up here again. So fading LM in this case is going to be pound LM1. Then we're going to call total time again. Total time is 3,000. We just said I is going to be 1. 1 times 3,000 is 3,000. And fade time, we've said it before, that's 1,000. Delay time, we've said it before, that's 2,000. And fade time, that's going to be equal to 1,000. All right, so this is a line of code that's going to be created for all the page elements that we want to fade in and out between the first and last one. And as you can see, except for the quote around pound LM, it's pretty exact. So let's run our code. Everything should work. If there's errors, we can always go back and fix them. So far, so good. And the last message should fade in, but not fade out. Excellent. Now, the beauty of this code is that it is 100% dynamic. If we give this code to someone who doesn't know JavaScript, we can just give them some simple instructions, and they can adjust it without knowing how to code JavaScript at all. So for example, let's say we gave it to someone who didn't want to fade in 4 elements like we have here. They instead want to fade in 6 elements. So that means that they would have to plug them in, but they'd have to add numbers in sequence to LM. So there'd be LM4, LM5, and I'll just change the message here. Call this message 5, and I'll call this one message 6. So that's done, and then let's say they also wanted to adjust the timing. Let's speed things up a bit. I'm going to have elements fade in and fade out in half a second, and their delay I'm going to shorten. I'm going to make that 1 second. So basically there should be 6 new elements fading in and fading out, and they should happen in a much quicker format. And when we only had 4 elements, this OMG, here's the 4th message. This is the element that did not fade out. It stayed on the screen when the animation was over. That one should fade out now, and message 6 shouldn't fade out. And I'll just put a little reminder here. Shouldn't fade. All right. So let's see if that happens. Yeah, everything's happening quicker. We see that. And now message 5 and message 6 shouldn't fade. Excellent. All right, so we've done a great job of creating some dynamic code using a for loop, and it's generating jQuery. But there are ways to make it better, and that's what the next video is going to be about. So let's do that.